Well, greetings, class. Today's lecture is going to cover death and dying. I'm actually going to start with the definition of death because I want to spend an adequate amount of time talking about the process of how one can go about assisting others who are actually in the process of dying. And the reason why I want to do that is because all of you have entered into the helping professions with a notion of wanting to serve and help others. Some of you are choosing to do that in the medical setting, others in speech pathology, others you may be thinking about being counselors or social workers or therapists. And so whomever you are, we all know that as a species, at one point in our lifetimes, we will be facing this notion of what death and dying means for us. But we'll also be serving individuals who also are wrestling with that very concept themselves. And so what's important to understand is I want to also be able to provide you with resources on how to serve individuals who are in the process of dying, or are maybe in the process of living with other individuals who they themselves are in the process of dying. And so the first part of this lecture is going to talk a little bit about the definition of death itself. And then we'll talk about the understanding of death as it changes across the lifespan. And in the part 2 series of this lecture, I'll give you some resources to manage and have conversations with individuals about this notion of death and dying, okay? So scientifically, we have a couple of definitions about death that pertain to the physiology of the human being, okay? And so from a physiological standpoint, what defines the moment of death is we have a definition of functional death. And functional death is referred to as the absence of a heartbeat and or breathing. And so the individual's cardiovascular system or their respiratory system shuts down, and that leads to functional death. However, there's no clear definitions in the medical industry, though, on how long functional death may need to exist or under what circumstances it exists in order to categorize someone as dead physically. What's interesting is the decision to label someone as dead comes from medical professionals who will then call it at that point, okay? But there's no clear-cut definition across the board on what constitutes someone actually being dead due to functional death. Now, the second definition related to death in the physiological sense is brain death, okay? This is when all signs of brain activity as measured by electrical brain waves have ceased. Once brain death occurs, it's impossible to restore functioning or to bring back the functioning of the brain once those electrical impulses have ceased. And so you see doctors have two forms of defining death, both functionally and related to the brain. This is why some individuals may be kept on ventilators or life support because there is still a demonstration of some brain activity going on. And the hope is, sometimes on behalf of medical professionals, that the body, parts of the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, or other vital organs may pick up and allow that individual to restore consciousness. In either case, though, these are the definitions surrounding the physiological definition of death. Okay, we've taken a moment to define death from a physiological standpoint. Now what I'd like to do is talk about the perception of death as it exists amongst individuals who are at different points in their lifespan. The reason this is important to understand is because if you're serving a client who, let's say they themselves is dying, but they're relatively younger, let's say in their teens or in early adulthood, then they're going to perceive their death and their illness much differently than from someone who's in late adulthood, okay, or is considered an aging adult. Likewise, sometimes you will be serving patients who are living or caring for someone who is dying, and they're of a different age in the lifespan. And so for that reason, it's really important to understand that as people age, their perception of death changes significantly, as well as even the notion of how they fear death or don't fear death based on these points in their lifespan. But also to understand that in particular, some deaths along the lifespan development are primarily very difficult for human beings to cope with for several reasons. And so for that reason, what I'd like to do is point our attention to infancy and childhood. And so some of you may have heard this term before of SIDS, okay? SIDS is defined as sudden infant death syndrome, okay? And this is when miscarriages or prenatal death, okay, are particularly difficult to confront with or cope with for parents. Many times, the death of a child tends to be the most severely impactful, all right, event for parents. In fact, the divorce rate actually for parents who have a child pass away is extremely high. There's a lot of particular reasons for this. Particularly in our culture, parents often believe that their children should outlive them. And within cultures where there's an accelerated and stable sense of healthcare, the morbidity rate of children is fairly low, okay? And so for that reason, we begin to think that there's a natural expectation that if you're young, you should survive and outlive your parents. In many other cultures around the world, in third world countries, in countries that don't have developed systems of healthcare to the same degree, this is not necessarily the case. So for example, children in Mexico weren't given names, okay, until later, 3, sometimes 4 weeks after birth, because individuals were waiting to determine if the health of the infant would equate to them being able to survive for weeks past birth. And so what you saw in some cultures is that children who were born were automatically baptized or ordained, if you will, into their religion instantly, but they weren't given names or even birth certificates until months after the children had been safe and stable in regards to their health. Okay. Now, it's important to also understand that children, all right, perceive death very differently. Okay, they don't see death the same way that a young adult or a middle adult or an aging adult would. Okay, and so children actually don't develop a concept of death, a solid understanding of what death is, until about the age of 5. And so for younger kids, particularly those, of 0 to 4 years old, when adults are speaking about death, they really don't understand that what that means is that individual won't be around any longer. In many cases, they believe that death can actually be something like a reduced state of living, okay, or even such as an extended sleep. And so the concept that this individual is not going to come back isn't fully grasped and understood until they progress later into their lifespan, until they become 5, 6, or 7. And they start to understand that that individual who we stated passed away or had died is not coming back, that they're not going to see them again, okay? And for that reason, children in particular, young children can often develop natural misunderstandings about death that also have deep emotional consequences for them, okay? So some of these assumptions that they might have is that if they did something wrong, something as simple as they didn't finish their dinner, or they didn't put their clothes in the dirty laundry, or whatever the case is, that they could be responsible, that if they had done those things, this person wouldn't have died, okay? And they also believe that if a person wanted to, all right, come back from death, that they really could. Now, these ideas stem from this notion, though, of not being able to understand and really conceive what the notion of death is, particularly in relation to its permanency. Okay, they're still forming this idea of death. And so remember what I said before is that perspectives on death change across the lifespan. And so what you have here are, in adolescence, kiddos who are in their adolescent stage understand the finality of death, all right, but they start to distance themselves from it. They say, well, I'm so young, death can never happen to me. So death is something that impacts older people, but I can never really die, okay? In young adulthood, all right, what we see is young adults feel primed to begin their lives and eager to change the world. So when someone encounters a severe illness in young adulthood, it can actually lead to fears of anger and frustration. And that's primarily because in this age, you're developing this sense of how I want to change the world. What's the difference that the legacy that I want to leave behind, the impact that I want to have on society. And so death is almost seen as an inconvenience because you're so forward thinking in young adulthood. Then what you really start to see death as is something that's going to slow your ability to make the changes that you want in the world. Now, in middle adulthood, the concept of death starts to change a little bit. It can actually shock individuals, okay, a life-threatening disease. There's not necessarily a great fear of death, all right, at this age, but the thought of suddenly dying impacts this group the most. Now, I'm actually in the process of transitioning from young adulthood to middle adulthood. And so this is my last year, technically, in the young adulthood age category, and I'm moving into middle adulthood. And what I would say to this is, I guess I'm somewhere in between these two stages for me, right? There's still a lot of things that I want to do and I want to accomplish and hopefully make a difference in people's lives with the time that I have left here. But in terms of middle adulthood, the shock of death doesn't really worry me, right? I know that it's going to happen, but I would say that the fear of death for me is probably moderate. You know, I think more about if I were to pass, the impact that it would have on my wife and on my daughter rather than necessarily the impact on me. And so I think that this would be congruent with what most middle adults tend to think, is that their death doesn't necessarily come as a shock to them. It's not necessarily something that they fear, but they do have concerns about how things will be left around them, okay, if they were to suddenly pass. Now, what's interesting is in late adulthood, okay, this particular group knows that the end is approaching in terms of their lifespan. And they face increasing number of deaths in their environment because other family and friends who are their age are also passing away. And so older people, when they hear that someone passes, may want details about their deaths. And it's also particularly important to understand that as of recent years, suicidality, particularly in individuals 55 and older, has been extremely high. Part of the reason for that is also due to increased medical costs and bills that are left when someone becomes seriously ill. And so many individuals who are of the aging community are actually choosing at this point to take their own lives rather than leave large amounts of debt for their family to incur once they've passed. And so that is a sad increased pattern that we're seeing within this particular age group. Okay, so I know that this week's lecture was a little short, and the reason for that is because in part two of this lecture, I want to share with you two brief videos of some really great resources that you can use not only in your own personal life, but with others who are maybe talking about this notion of death and dying. I know that right now, especially with everything that's going on with the COVID-19 virus, is that death is being talked about quite frequently, right? Morbidity rates, the rates of infection, and obviously the number of deaths that are incurred with COVID-19 is being discussed. More so than ever I've ever seen in my lifetime in our society, we're talking about death in terms of statistics, in terms of loss, in terms of the humanness of it as related to this. And I think what's also really important to understand is that it's having an impact on all of us across the lifespan. It doesn't matter if you're a young adult or if you're an aging adult or middle adult, whatever the case is. When death is spoken about um, so dominantly in our culture right now, it has an impact of all of us. So part two's lesson is going to cover more resources and I think hopefully helpful tools that will assist you in understanding as well as talking about death with others that you know. So just a general reminder for this week, please be sure to check Blackboard for your assignments. Also be sure to complete your assessment quiz following this lecture so that I can give you attendance for this week. Please also know that I'm here for you, okay? Please reach out to me with any questions that you have. I am happy to reach out and to set up an appointment with you. I miss you all right? So let me know if there's anything I can do for you, all right? And finally, we'll go ahead and close out with our centering. Today's centering verse will come from Revelation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, then I will enter his house and dine with him and he with me. Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. And the word will be acceptance for this week, acceptance. I know I used this same scripture verse a couple of lectures ago, and I'm intentionally keeping it for this week because this word acceptance, as I said in the last lecture, means different things to different people, right? So sometimes we think of acceptance as accepting others who are different from us. But we're talking about death and dying this week, right? And we're going through a lot with this COVID-19 virus pandemic. And so what does the notion of acceptance mean as it relates to our lesson on death? And what does this notion of acceptance mean for you in your relationship with God, right? What is maybe God calling you to accept in your life that maybe we haven't had to think about as frequently, right, as we do now, okay? So let's go ahead and make sure your hands and feet are in a nice comfortable position. Close your eyes, and for 2 minutes, let's just focus on what God is speaking into our hearts in this moment, right? Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and anyone who hears my voice and opens the door, then I will enter their house and dine with them, and he with me, right? So in this notion of opening the door, what are we accepting? What are we allowing God to speak into our hearts and our minds at this moment? Take a nice deep breath, close your eyes, and I'll come back to us in 2 minutes. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. Come on back. I want to say thank you very much to all of you for tuning in for this week's lecture. When we join for part 2, I'm looking forward to sharing those resources for you, and I hope you find them useful. All right? Talk to you soon.